Hello and welcome to another episode of Between Two Psychs with myself and Adam. So today we are going to be talking about preparedness for learning. On many occasions, I've had the privilege of going into lessons and seeing fantastic delivery, which have been very well planned, include very good differentiation. Yet some children still don't engage. Any thoughts on that, Adam?
Yeah, it makes me wonder, is it enough just to have a good lesson plan, or do we need to think more about schools being organisms, like we said last week, how things interact with each other? Because you know, and I know that many teachers we work with can come up with phenomenal lesson plans. But if that lesson plan doesn't resonate with the kids, then it's a non-starter, isn't it?
It really is. So what sort of things do you think we need to consider when you mention the word resonate?
Uh, I never want to treat any classroom as, one size fits all. I've just come from a school whereby the needs of that class are very different from the one next door. And they're both, year threes. One is very bubbly and the other one can kind of just sit down and get on with it. And when you speak, I think being a teacher, it's very easy to internalize that as something I've done wrong. And there's always aspects of our practice that we can improve on, whether you're a teacher, a psychologist, head teacher, you could even an Ofsted inspector. But you got to understand who you're working with as well. What is it about these kids? How do they work together? How do they
Mm,
interact with one another? And that's where
mm.
my conversations took me today was how do these children interact with each other? How does the teacher understand it? And it came down to she started to segment them the different types of learners. And she said, well, when this group does this, then that group does that. And I said, okay, when you try to do your lesson plan, when does it go out the window? And she said, well, if this small group of children doesn't get it straight away, well, the whole lesson's out the window. And I said, is that where you need to start then?
Absolutely. So there's a response to the lesson and the tasks that are being designed to include in the lesson. So I think one of the things that we should consider then is what stops children engaging with the lesson. You talk there about peer relationships. Another thing to consider or is the neurobiology of stress and the learning brain. I know that's something you've mentioned before in other episodes, but where we start considering the impact of stress upon the ability to process and absorb information.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, stress is one of these things that we learn more and more about each day and each year that passes. And one of the things I've recently come across is the impact of dopamine. When dopamine is released in a calm state, it becomes a very targeted tool for learning. It impacts very specific parts of the brain that allows you to make associations that improves learning. So you know different categories, you know how to apply conjunctives, you know how to write between the lines. When you enter into a learning environment where it's overstimulating, lots of dopamine's released, and stress does that because it's also got a protective factor to it because it allows you to be more alert. And increasingly, children are feeling more stressed. Don't forget, we've had the pandemic, and the baseline for stress in young children is naturally higher as a result of that. And I don't think we've fully come to grips with that as a sector. And our poor teachers are tasked with managing that. So I think the first thing is to have a real honest conversation with someone who you trust about, is your classroom a stressful environment?
yeah, yeah,
Do you feel stressed in it as a teacher?
yeah, absolutely. We can talk as psychologists and lay people about the impact of stress upon ourselves. I'm just wondering if there's any mileage in having a look at some of the research that we use as ed psychs to support our thinking. And one of the people that I've come across in my line of work is Perry's research, Bruce Perry.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in the back of my head, I remember reading something from him, which is essentially a child's ability to think, reason, and learn depends on their emotional and physiological state. So we have to kind of remember that we're not just teaching, we're trying to get a balance between the emotional and physiological state within the children. And that he wrote that when the stress response is activated, the brain prioritizes survival over learning. And I think that's pretty much what you were just describing there.
Yeah. Bruce Perry, for those who aren't aware, wrote a very seminal text. Was it The Boy Who's Raised as a Dog? Is that what I'm thinking of, Mike?
I can't remember, actually, Adam. It could be.
I believe it was The Boy Who's Raised as a Dog. That's my research for this pod. And but his work is applicable across just the mental health field. It does tap into education, and it highlights that the relationships you have in your life support learning. And I think, and I believe I'm in good company when I say this, Mike, the foundations of a good learning environment are the relationships between teacher and child, teacher and TA.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? Linked to that, it reminds me of something else that you spoke about a few episodes ago called the polyvagal theory.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not mistaken, that is looking at the nervous system and how it's constantly scanning for safety or threat. So again, linked with Perry's work, as a teacher, we're starting to have a look at how important it is to get that balance, and therefore looking at strategies to either support the children who are going through cognitive overload or support the children who have got emotional overload. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And, you just said, and I think it's a very important point, is the cognitive overload is something that we need to address. And I think it's becoming a more poignant part in education. It's particularly in my work. I work a lot with senior leaders, and they point out stress points within the school, which usually means I have really in-depth conversations with teachers, like most ed psychs, I suppose. But what is happening in that type of work is that the cognitive load that children are facing now and the cognitive load that teachers are facing now has ramped up because the curriculum has changed. So imagine your child going from key stage 1 to key stage 2. The skill set that they're expected to have entering key stage 3 is huge. They're expected to be skilled readers and writers almost immediately. From a psychodevelopmental point of view, most psychologists would argue we'd rather start formal learning closer to 7 than what is currently, because that's when the brain is at a mature enough state that it can absorb that skill set or start to engage with that skill set. Then you've got the frameworks that teachers are expected to work within. We've got the new Ofsted one. And the initial findings from that is that it's quite stressful for teachers. The expectations placed on them for those fundamental skills is being looked at in detail. So you've got a teacher who's experiencing high cognitive load, and you've got a child who's experiencing high cognitive load. The outcome of that can only be stress. So how do you manage that stress? We spoke earlier about working through senior leaders and how to manage that. And I think fundamentally what's got to come from this conversation between you and I is, how do we put the relationships at the forefront of learning?
Yeah.
And how do we create environments or systems that allow teachers to take a moment for themselves and address that stress? What about in your own practice, Mike? Have you come across anything like I've just described?
Absolutely, Adam. Yeah, sadly, all too often. It's important that, in this episode, but also in our work, is that we do remember the pivotal role that teachers hold in terms of children's development. but also the pivotal role that they hold in terms of holding children in the palm of their hand, and not only having to, like we said earlier, be responsible for the teaching and learning, but also, whilst holding their children, is being responsible for their psychological well-being. And what a tough job that is, to get that balance. And then meanwhile, you've got to try and keep yourself in some form of equilibrium so that you are prepared to teach as well as the others are prepared to learn.
Yeah.
Very, very, very difficult challenge, which many teachers do so well.
Yeah.
We're all human, and this is what we are looking at today. We are all human, and sometimes that balance just tips one way or the other.
Yeah. Increasingly, I work with in a framework that's worrying me because I'm seeing a lot of teachers tip into that overwhelm point, and the quality of their work does fall, and it falls at a worrying rate.
Yeah.
And they're trying their best to pick themselves up. And I suppose this is the nature of the education system. We don't provide enough supervision that allows them to think with clarity. You know, this is the expectation. Make sure it happens. If those kids aren't progressing based on the linear paths that we've set for them.
Yeah.
So it comes back to the question, how do we create these learning environments? Who wants to kick it off, me or you?
Well, if you got something, let's go with it, Adam.
Well, the first thing I've got is, I think as any teacher, you should always be questioning 3 factors in equilibrium. Okay. Now, this doesn't apply for every child, but it does hit a broad spectrum. The first factor is sensory development. What does the sensory needs of your whole class look like? Are they more sensory needy than others, or are they sensory seeking, or are they sensory avoiding? The second one is to consider language, particularly emotional literacy. Are they children that are quite articulate in terms of their ability to speak their thoughts, but emotionally immature? So they don't have the emotional language to go with it. Or have they got a good balance whereby if they were feeling upset, they could come to you and explain that in a well-articulated way, even when upset or in distress? And the third thing is their emotional development or relational development. Not only their relationship with you, but the relationship with their peers, the relationship with other adults in the school. Who are the key adults that stick out for that classroom? There'll be a small handful of them. And I think you always have to look at one of those factors or 3 of those factors. And when you're looking to make a change, it's very hard to hit all 3 of them at the same time. Aim for 2. That's what I say. Aim for 2. So if it's a case of you've got a bubbly classroom all the time, it might be, for me, I'd be thinking, do I need to up the amount of sensory breaks I give them? Do I need to up the amount of mindful work I give them? Do I need to think about the transitions back in the classroom after lunch and break times? Do I need to do something that's grounding? If it is a case of the relational side, do I need to find pockets of time that I need to spend with key students in the classroom, just playing some low cognitive or low loading demand activities, things like Uno, things like Double? And the last one, language. Do I need to do some explicit teaching? Is there someone who's got a good skill set around this? Is there an ELSA, emotional literacy support assistant, in the building? Those are the sort of things I always start with when I'm working directly with teachers about how they can manage bubbly classrooms, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's 3 strong pillars there, Adam. And I think when you look at a tripod of approaches, it enables you to then start saying, right, well, if I take the language, for example, what am I going to do about that? You can really kind of have a look at the depth and breadth of language being used. So it's a good triad. I use something similar, but under a sort of different lens. And we've spoken about it before, but Maslow's hierarchy. And I think to myself, okay, if I'm wanting to promote equilibrium, a balance of physiological and psychological, then I might start thinking about the the bottom layer, which is about physical needs, and the next layer up about safety. So I'd be thinking, okay, learning, which is a higher level function, sits on top of physical safety, emotional safety, and belonging.
Mm-hmm.
If those lower needs wobble, then the cognitive engagement is going to wobble. So I might then be having a look at, like you said, predictable routines, making them feel safe without upsetting the apple cart. Warm, consistent greetings. Again, you were talking about that. Tone, so a calm tone over repeated instructions. You were talking about that. And repair after conflict. So when things do go wrong, it's been able to fix them, basically.
Yeah. He fix them. Can't fix anyone in this job.
But yeah, you're right. But on top of that, we then also start looking at the areas that we cover as ed sites. So we might start looking at special educational needs. So those things you're talking about are good mainstream practices, and the things I mentioned are good mainstream practices. And sometimes then you have to sort of enhance aspects of that to meet the needs of children that have particular requirements. Those children could be affected by trauma, and we know a lot about trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed schools now. They may be affected by special educational needs, so a standard being a cognition and learning difficulty.
Yeah.
And these can have significant stress on individuals. So the teacher now is going from looking at the whole class to particular individuals with very specific needs.
Mm-hmm. The dilemma I came across in a recent consultation was a very limited resource base in terms of what this teacher had at hand. So we're talking not many adults, and how to deliver a curriculum whereby there was a high level of SEN, but not the SEN that can't access the curriculum. So you're not looking at EHCPs, you're looking at SEN, good scaffolding. And the dilemma we came across was the lesson planning doesn't need to be top down. Start with your top learners and move your way down when you're planning, or bottom up. And without answering, I'm like, what way would you go? Do you go top down or bottom up?
I would probably go bottom up.
So would I. I think most teachers go top down. But I'm wondering, is that a case of, because we're psychologists, we would think more towards the send end, or is there some nugget of truth within going bottom up?
I wonder with that, Adam, because when I talk to a lot of teachers, they're very, very mindful about the needs of everybody in that classroom. And I think the natural instinct is to go bottom up. But then you've got the pressure of performance and, KPIs and tables, etc. So
Heaven forbid if you're in an Ofsted window.
Exactly, Ofsted. So you've got the natural inclination of a person versus the professional demands that, as a teacher, you've got to achieve these levels at this age.
And it brings in another pressure that we've just highlighted in 2 or 3 sentences there. The key pressures are impacted on teachers that they're not really at liberty to complain about. You and I can, because we're not teachers, but it does have a profound impact on them and the students they're supporting. And what I am learning, the more and more I speak with teachers, is that passion for the job, but without the systems in place to support them, the passion starts to fall and the goodwill starts to fall and the learners struggle. So are we in a position where we need to start really looking at the frameworks that we expect out of teachers? Are we still at the stage where psychological tweaking and strategies is enough?
Both, I think. And the angle that I would be taking as an ed psych, and also if I were in the classroom now, would be when I'm preparing a lesson, or evaluating the lesson, I would keep two words in my head. One is the psychological, the other is physiological. And I would be saying psychological versus physiological.
When you say physiological, are you alluding to the sensory development, or are you thinking of something else?
Yeah, exactly that. As you were talking about the fight or flight syndrome, the polyvagal research, making sure that stress is addressed. And, when I was talking about the Maslow hierarchy, the stress isn't just to do with an emotional state. That stress could be coming because a child's coming into schools knowing that they've got a test today, or the child is coming into school knowing that I've got to do my reading intervention and I hate reading. Anything like that can really activate that fight or flight response. So that's why I'll be keeping those two words in my head.
Yeah. And, as we come to the tail end of this podcast, I want to spend a bit of time focusing on the relationship aspect of it and just how important that is. And, the conscious thought that a teacher has to put into those relationships. It's not just enough to deliver the curriculum anymore, is it?
No, it really isn't, and it's a wonderful thing. When I was at school, relationship between children and teachers is nothing like it is now. It's almost like a family. The teachers almost have that sort of parental role, don't they?
Many of the teachers probably do. Quite often I say you're almost like a third parent when you're supporting these children. And depending on which area you work in, depending on socioeconomic status or factors that are available, you may be the most positive person in that child's life. And there's a lot of responsibility with that, but a huge privilege with it too. And again, we come back to how the systems have to look after teachers in order to fulfill that role. Because as myself being a new parent, when you're exhausted, it's very hard to be bubbly and funny and playful and accepting and curious and empathetic. All the Dan Hughes. You going to correct me on it?
Yes, absolutely, Adam. It's all there. So again, if we take the framework of physiological versus psychological and weave in relational that you're just referring to, that ability to develop and sustain a relational approach with children is going to enable you as a teacher to be able to talk through challenges with the child, knowing that that child can relate and trust you, which is a lot easier to hold those conversations compared to when that child isn't relating to you, doesn't, trust you. So talking about things that might be activating the stress, which is the physiological element of the equation, will be a lot easier adopting the relational approach that you're promoting.
And when children feel cared for, they're much more likely to go along with episodes of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because when you think about delivering, I'm just thinking about a young boy I observed today, and he wasn't that far behind the curriculum, but really struggled with aspects of his maths. And just by having the relationship with the teacher, he's like, I don't get this bit, but I'm going to sit and see if I get it, because that teacher has an idea about me. Doesn't have doesn't have over expectations, but also not under expectation. And the more the teacher can build relationships across the class, the trust factor comes in. And I always say to the teachers, if those children who dysregulate the most, if they know you've got their back, then all the other children know that you care for them, even if you don't have to interact with them that much during the day, because you're taking care of the neediest children in terms of emotional need. And there's a huge trust factor that goes within that.
Yeah, there is, Adam, absolutely. So just thinking then, so you've got a teacher that's either thinking top down or bottom up. I mean, it depends really, I suppose, on the situation. But, sometimes you may find that you're under pressure, so your lesson is top down. Other times you may feel that you've got more freedom to be creative with the lessons, and the bottom up. So we've got that. We're considering relationships and the importance of relationships. We're also considering the research and what it tells us about how humans work, whatever the age. So we've looked at the physiological versus psychological. Do you think we need to just consider anything else that might be, from an EdSite point of view, supportive to teachers when they're thinking along that physiological versus psychological line?
Physiological versus psychological. Yeah. So we mentioned polyvagal, and it's a strategy rather than a theory that I'm getting at. And I was just thinking about almost teaching them box breathing, that count to 4, breathe in, hold for 4, and then breathe out for 4, and then repeat that. And what that does in terms of polyvagal is it forces the nervous system to activate the parasympathetic system. And if you're struggling with transitions and things like that, if you can get the whole class to do it at the same time, great. But if you can get your early adopters to start doing it, and then they show the next kid how to do it, and you get this sort of Mexican wave or domino effect, then over time, those children might start to accept strategies that are linked with polyvagal theory. And it may be that when you come in from a busy lunch period, they've each got their own preference. Some might do box breathing, some might do mindful music, some might do mindful coloring. And there's no reason why that couldn't work primary or secondary school, in my view.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else to add before we close this one down, Adam?
No, if I opened anything more up, I'd probably start speaking about the well-being of head teachers, but that's probably a separate episode in itself. We've talked a lot about supporting teachers to think about the factors that go into healthy learning.
We did.
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Adam.